One of the things that I did in a previous life, for the last 15 years actually, was a lecture in the aviation degree at Edith Cowan University. And as a part of the degree, the students had to do research into various things. This, of course, is the way that people, like professors and associate professors and so on, become famous, because their students do all this research and then they put their name to it, because the students can't, because they haven't qualified yet. Part of the requirements of the ethos was to, in fact, have something in the course where students actually had to find out if they were going into the aviation universe, where they'd actually come from. And so they had to learn or do something on the history of aviation. And so therefore that gave me a great opportunity to find all sorts of things. And one of them was I found out all about West Subiaco Aerodrome. When I started to fly, it was actually printed on the chart as an aerodrome out the back of Shenton Park, and I didn't really, I could never find it actually. There were very good reasons for that. So, having a soft spot for West Subiaco Aerodrome, that's why I chose that particular one. Now, this aerodrome was officially opened on the 8th of October in 1929, and it was the first licensed private aerodrome in Western Australia. And it was established by a businessman called I keep tripping over his name, Ittershagen, yes. Hermann Ittershagen. He was born in Germany, you'll be surprised to know. And that was in 1872. He came to Australia in 1899, and that was to Sydney, and then ended up in Perth in 1903, where he started a wicker manufacturing business in Subiaco, although we now call it Shenton Park. In 1921, there was a bit of a gap there where Germans kept their heads down in Australia, I believe. In 1921 he became the German consul in Western Australia, and he returned to Germany in that role and went and spoke to a person called Heinrich Lanz, L-A-N-Z, and some of the people with even less hair than me will probably remember that he had something to do with tractors, and in fact he was building what was a tractor which could run on crude oil. So he went to there in 1922. In 1927 he accepted the opportunity to become the distributor for the Lanz Bulldog tractor. And as part of his plan, he wanted a backup service to be able to, if he was going to sell it to farmers, he wanted to be able to provide service for it by either taking parts out to the farms, or alternatively having the mechanics go out to the farms. So his thinking was, if I've got an aircraft business, if I've got aircraft to do this, this will fit in quite nicely. Now there weren't that many aerodromes around in that day, but let me just point to some of them. The first one was Belmont Park, which you'll recall the very first aircraft flew from. That was with Hammond back in 1911, I think it was, or 12. The next one was Langley Park, where West Australian Airways started flying, and after about 4 years later, after realising how illegal this was, one was built at Maylands, and it was the first of the licensed aerodromes. And the next one then was West Subiaco. That followed, or following that came Rottnest, Pearce in 38, Guildford in the early 40s, now Perth International, Jandakot, Rockingham, although that was only around for about 2 years, Serpentine and Murrayfield. And those represented the major ones. West Subiaco, if you wanted to find it, you'd have to look on that part of your road map, and were you to do so, you'd find it in there. That's That's Perry Lake Stadium there, and that's Perry Lakes there. West Subiaco Aerodrome was eventually put on to the map, if you like, and here is an early, a 1930s indication of what West Subiaco looked like. It's about a mile west of Subiaco and 2 miles from the coast, and I won't make any effort to change these into kilometres because looking around all the heads in here, we were all round in imperial measure as well as metric, so you can do your own conversions. It was surrounded by bush and tall trees. The tall trees were chewits, they were too hard to cut, so they had a lot of gelignite available at the time, and that's how they managed to do a lot of the clearing, and the timber was sold. There's the landing ground in there, and Perry Lakes doesn't show there, it's Gibney Swamp. So Perry was probably a politician, and when it got cleared, he got his name on it. That was what the field looked like, and those were its dimensions. And for a person flying past on the east side of it, that's what it looked like at the time. Now, it took about 2 years for them to clear the land and level it and grass it. And then finally, a hangar was built. For the locality map itself. This, I realise you can't read, but it's got some interesting stuff on it, which tells you that it had an area of about 66 acres. The approaches were over scattered bush, a sandy and grass surface, slightly undulating rise towards the north side. A fire can be lit on the same when an aeroplane is expected, so I would light a fire. I presume that was at night. Telephone was in the hangar. The key was at the piggery opposite. Water at the same place, and the magnetic variation was 4 degrees 45 minutes west. It's changed a bit since, as have the telephone numbers, B1343 and B1659. In certain places, like just below the airfield there are certain things that some of you may remember. That was called the Hospital for the Insane. It's now called John the 23rd College. My son-in-law came from there, and I think probably a bit rubbed off. That's Victoria Hospital, and I think Victoria Hospital is probably what is now the Royal Perth Hospital Rehab. But you can get the picture of it. Now the hangar was built in 1929, and that was sort of the last part of the aerodrome. And it was following that in March 29, it was announced to the public by Ideshagen that he would now get an aeroplane. And the aeroplane that he was going for was called the Clem monoplane. Sounds a bit German, doesn't it? It was to provide aerial services for this business. Now that he got the business of being the agent for Lance Tractors, this was to go with it. It was piloted by a bloke called Harry Baker, whose name is in West Australian aviation history well and truly, and it made its maiden flight. In fact, this photograph is purported to be its maiden flight on 21st of August 1929. It was made from plywood and fabric, as was the custom of the day, powered by a 40 horsepower engine, had a maximum speed of almost 80 miles an hour. Its fuel consumption was 42 miles to the gallon. Its wingspan was 43 feet, which is about 7, 8 feet, in that order, bigger than the Cessna 172. The wings could be folded along the fuselage, and it cost £775. Won't try to translate that, but in the day it was about what a good quality car cost. Now, Harry Baker was a well-known motorcyclist, racing motorcyclist around town. He was one of the first West Australians to be trained at the Maylands Aerodrome. Now, when the Ideshagen had the Clem fly for the first time, about 10 days later, well not about, actually 10 days later, he then put it into a race. I'm not sure how Baker felt about this. The race was from Sydney to Perth, and at that stage it was the longest air race in history. Aviation history changed a bit after that. And so the aircraft was put into that because it was obviously regarded by Hagen as being good publicity. Well, he got disqualified from the overall race at Adelaide, but he had by that stage won 3 individual handicap sections, and he was last across the finishing line. Harry Baker was the resident instructor in Western Australia at the time at the West Subiaco Aerodrome. He trained Eileen Dean Williams, who was the first woman to own an aircraft and gain her commercial pilot's licence in Western Australia. And she was also the first woman of any state to do a solo return trip from Perth to Sydney. He also trained another lady called Helen Prosser, and she was the first woman to gain a pilot's licence in Western Australia. After the business opened in 1929, a 3-seater Clem arrived. Only about a month later, it had floats, and I've actually seen a picture of this aircraft, although I don't have it here, on floats in Thompson Bay at Rottnest. They were interchangeable with the wheels. The aircraft actually crashed near Manjimup in 1932, but returned to service in 1933, as were the way with things which were only built of plywood and fabric. The year tractor service got underway, and the spare parts and the experts were delivered to the farm. Now, Hagen then founded the Subiaco Flying Club. Whoops, I was afraid that was going to happen. There we are. And this was a brochure on the Subiaco Flying Club. And I'm going to read a little bit to you. Obviously, it was in the newspapers of the day, so some of you may have already read it. But it asked anyone who was interested in witnessing a flying examination for a pilot certificate by a 58-year-old pupil of the club, Mr. H.C. Hagen, on Friday morning at 8:30. How would you like to have had all of Perth come out to watch you do your pilot's licence tests? Things are different, aren't they? But there's some very interesting things. You could actually join the club for £1, 1 shilling, or a guinea as it was known in those days. And for that you get a flight and some lectures, and most importantly a club badge, which you see in the centre there. What happened next, of course, as most people will know, was the start of the 1930-31, and things went down, and it later became called a depression, when the price of farm produce such as wheat fell below the cost of production. So, although this Subiaco Flying Club was there in order to boost training and in order to boost private pilots being able to use aircraft, things started to go bad to the extent that no longer in the business could the aircraft operate on their own. They would need to earn some more revenue. So they did this by pleasure flights, aerial taxi work, flying tuition. The Clem was actually hired out to a Maylands-based company called Wings Limited, which then later moved part of its operation out to Subi. And when Perth's first gliding club was formed, there was Harry Baker again, sitting a lot closer to the ground this time. There were in fact 4 gliding clubs at the time. They were all invited to come out to Subiaco. And this is where the Gliding Club of Western Australia started, before it finally ended up, after a couple of other moves, out at Cunderdin. But as I say, that was part of its history. Hagen actually believed that gliding was very important for pilots, and if they did a lot of gliding, they became much easier to train. Remember, that was in the 1930s. I think it was the German way of thinking at the time, in the 1930s, to make lots of glider pilots. The first public demonstration of gliding in Western Australia took place at that aerodrome when 4,000 people came out through the bush to watch the gliding club launch the primary gliders. And then they had things like the Great Aerial Pageant. This is a poster for that. We won't worry about Granny's green ginger, I presume she managed to sell it. The Parts That Matter commenced at 2 o'clock on that day. It had the WA Aero Club, which later became the Royal Aero Club of WA. Wings Limited, the Aerial Commerce Company, which was the name that Iddershagen had for his company. The Baker Aviation Company, so I guess he was a contract pilot. The Glider Clubs, the Model Aero Club, and interestingly the Subiaco Unemployed Relief Committee. And then when we look down the bottom, that all of the money for this went to the Subiaco Unemployed Relief Fund. So that was something that was of the times. It gave an indication of then, if you saved your ticket, which cost 1 shilling, it didn't come up there very well, then you could win a free flight. Those were the days when you could get in for a shilling. It came with the whole plan of the West Subiaco Aerodrome. And things were starting to happen rather quickly, but the Depression was starting to drag people down fairly quickly as well. One of the companies that got dragged down was Wings Limited, and they had a bright blue Simmons Spartan aircraft, VHUMQ. That was in the very first slide we saw. And in an attempt to, that was taken over by the Subiaco, by Aerial Commerce Company. In an attempt to broaden the appeal, the Iddershagen agreed to a plan by Brooklands, WA, to use the aerodrome for motor racing. And that's green line there indicates where the motor racing track was. Actually it's crushed limestone, not green. Everything else out there was green though. And today, if you went looking for it, you'd find it there. And in fact, part of it, you could go and walk on part of it that's under that arrow there. If you're interested in wandering back into some past history on the big map, it's out there. On July the 23rd, 1932, which became a significant date, a big carnival was organised on the ground which combined aerial, motor, athletic and novelty events, and the program included a race between a Douglas motorcycle, a supercharged Triumph and the Clem monoplane, which was an easy winner. I think it was rigged, you wouldn't want them to come there and find anything else that could go faster than it. There was a parachute, a leap from the wing of a gypsy moth. However, the event was marred when the Clem flew very low on a bank turn near the hangar and struck 2 men, one of whom suffered serious injury. And that accident signalled the failure of Brooklands WA Limited, which went into liquidation in October. A few weeks later, Iddershagen's company, the Aerial Commerce Company, ceased to function. And by the end of the year, all unsubsidised civil aviation ventures in WA had failed. In 1934, when WA was beginning to recover from the Depression, Lance withdrew their agency, so Iddershagen went and saw people elsewhere and became the agent for the Hungarian steel horse tractor. I've never heard of it, but possibly you have. By 1937, he was servicing 50 steel horse tractors and about 100 Lance Bulldogs. But the wick on his wicker business had gone out by that. In 1940, Iddershagen suffered poor health and began to negotiate the sale of the 2 Clems with an amateur pilot named Don White. The aircraft had been left unattended in the hangar and hadn't flown since 1933, 7 years before. However, before the transaction could be completed, Iddershagen died, but his wife carried on and sold it for the sum, the aircraft, the hangar, everything, for the sum of £5. White donated the airframe of the 3-seater Clem to the WA Flying Club, which had taken over the lease of the aerodrome. And he set about to rebuild the 2-seater. And sometime in 1942, the undergrowth was removed. That's the only picture of undergrowth I've got. And that's the racetrack running through. White started flying from there. Unfortunately, although they flew about 200 or 300 hours, neither the pilot nor the aircraft were registered. And the Daily News, both of them, got on to this and wrote a report about all the flying out at the old Subiaco Aerodrome. Remember, this is 1942 now, and it got through to the RAF that somebody was flying from an airfield which wasn't supposed to be operational, and this was a security risk, so they came in and ploughed it all up. In about 1944, the hangar at West Subiaco was set alight, and the contents, including the gliders, the Clem and the Simmons Spartan, were all destroyed in the blaze. The hangar couldn't have been too badly affected because it was later removed by the university, who owned the land, and taken to Netherlands, where it became their first workshop. In the 1960s, the university converted the old landing ground into a sports field called McGillivray Oval, and today the only remains to be found are parts of the old limestone racetrack. However, there's one last twist to the story. 24 years after it had been ripped up, it was used again by a Cessna 206, which had suffered a throttle linkage failure over City Beach and managed to do what was not entirely a copybook landing, but then the book had omitted to include power lines, a short strip, irrigation pipes and an embankment. The pilot and 3 others have sustained injuries, and 2 of the passengers were unhurt. So that actually brings me back to the original list, because I believe that as a consequence of that last incident you saw, I might be the only pilot still alive and flying who's flown into all of those airfields except Belmont. And I decided if I wanted to test that theory, that this would be the forum which would have the answer. Thank you.